You're listening to the VegasTourist.com podcast, episode number 249, talking about We Are Going In. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark Anthony. This is the VegasTourist.com podcast. In this episode, I talk with Mike Nelson. Mike is the author of a book titled We Are Going In, a book about the 1956 midair collision between the United DC-7 and the TWA Constellation over the Grand Canyon. Mike's uncle was one of the victims of the Grand Canyon plane crash, a devastating crash that helped change the way we fly today. So now you may be asking yourself, why talk about an old plane crash somewhere over that big canyon on a podcast devoted to Vegas tourism? Well, glad you asked. Besides the obvious, that Las Vegas is very dependent on air travel for our tourist business, we found that out on September 11, 2001. There's actually a deeper reason. When I discovered on one of my first tours to the Grand Canyon National Park that there was actually a cemetery there, it was a spot I drove by several times and never saw it before. The fact that very few people even know that it's there. I was immediately drawn to it, as well as the history of the people who are buried there and their contributions to making the Grand Canyon what it is today. As you enter the cemetery, you are immediately drawn to a tall granite tower near the entrance that is dedicated to the people who lost their lives on the United flight. 29 unidentified souls are buried under this marker. I was hooked. Why is there a marker for one plane if two planes were involved? And again, how can two planes not see each other over such an open area that they actually ended up colliding with each other? What about the second plane? Where's the marker for that one? Well, I found out later there is actually one, and it's in Flagstaff, Arizona, about 90 miles away. Why there? Well, I wanted answers, and I found out that there were really no answers to why. It happened when we didn't have the controlled flight paths that we have from border to border today. Nobody saw the crash, and of course, nobody survived it. So theories is all we have to work with. In 2014, the crash site was actually listed as a historical site with new plaques at the Desert View Watchtower to commemorate and acknowledge the place where this happened. So what's the fascination here? Well, I found out when I started to share this information on my tours that, many people are fascinated about the history of the Grand Canyon, but yet very few people actually realize that A, air travel was not always like it is today, B, that there's a real cemetery at the Grand Canyon National Park that is really like a tiny look at the history of the people who worked, lived, and made the canyon their home. And then C, that this tragedy actually happened not far from where they are standing in the cemetery. Although there have been many theories as well as questions on how two commercial airliners can crash over such a wide open territory, nobody ever sat down to write about the accident and its aftermath from the side of those left behind, the families and the friends of the victims. Shortly after the crash reports were finalized and the last hearings on it were held, the families were basically told, shit happens, and they left it at that. Well, last year I came across Mike's book while on tour to the Grand Canyon, and unfortunately the following day he was actually going to do a presentation about it. Well, I was unable to make it back up there for that, so I sent him an email asking questions, and I got some very nice responses. So I ordered the book and almost devoured it immediately upon receiving it. Mike's book, We Are Going In, walks us through the entire flight from start to finish, and then on to the rescue and the recovery. What's fascinating is he puts us in the aircrafts, and we meet some of the people on the doomed flights. Then he takes us for a look on how air travel was like back then, the grandeur of it all, as well as the danger, the open skies, and how the planes communicated or did not communicate, and how they were tracked or not tracked. As compared to today's world of aviation, where every moment of the flight is tracked, he talks about the different theories that have been created about what might have happened and why, and he looks at them from an outsider's point of view. Now, in the interview, I call this the Twilight Zone method of descriptions. He's like stopping us in a moment of time and examining the surroundings and explaining the theories as we also look at the location and what was all going on or should have been going on at that moment. It's as if we stopped time for a moment and looked into the windows of the planes to see what everyone was doing. I found that to be a fascinating way to look at this tragedy. His sources were people who lived and worked in the airline business. They were there for the memorial, the investigation, or they knew the plane or crew members, as well as family members who were left waiting at the airports for a plane that never arrived. Or actually, in a few cases, for those who learned later that a family member was on the flight, but it was a surprise. To give you an example of how different air travel is compared to 1956, the title of the book is from the only distress call recorded as it was given by a crew member. Only after the planes failed to arrive did someone actually go back and listen to the distress call. Can you imagine that? Now, imagine that. A call from a plane, from an aircraft flying, and nobody's listening to it live. Something didn't happen. Let's go back and see if someone called us. That's part of the fascination here. So here's my call with Mike Nelson. The book is titled We Are Going In. Come back at the end for a wrap-up, would you please? And here is Mike Nelson. As a man living in Iowa, why would you write a book about a 60-year-old plane crash that happened 1,800 miles away?
That's a good question.
Yes.
It's got a really simple answer to it, though. I used to be a boy living in Chicago whose uncle was on one of the planes. And that, of course, just devastated my whole family. And nobody ever shut that off and tried to steer me away from bringing it up and talking about it. So I asked questions while I grew up. My interest just developed. And then for a time in my 20s or so, or maybe in my 30s too, I forgot about the whole thing. Somehow I just started thinking about it again in middle age, and I decided to find out about all of it. One thing led to another, where the more I found out, the more I was interested. And after a time, I realized I was amassing enough material to write a book. So that's how it happened. In a way, it was pure accident. I never intended to write a book.
It's always fascinating how people start down a road like that. You know, you don't expect to write a book. It's just, okay, I got enough. Plus the fact that what's out there is there's nothing that's really puts it all together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you did.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my object, one of my objects.
Without doing all of this research or previous to it, had you ever been out to the Grand Canyon?
No.
Oh.
I went out there just because of all of this. I went out there actually as a part of feeling the whole thing that I had written about, or that I should say that I was writing about.
Right.
I went out there before the book was written.
So you were out there when they dedicated the new markers out at Desert View.
That's right, yeah.
And you were out there with other family members from the event.
That's right, quite a few, yeah.
Really? What was that like?
I was surprised. Let me think. It was quite an honor because I'd been asked to give a speech. About 7 people gave speeches, and I was one of them, and I was the only one that was a family member. All the others were various officials, and it put me in a unique position where I really felt that more than I expected to, and so did the audience that was listening to me. It was really quite something, very moving.
I'm kind of in that same boat. I mean, I've been doing tours out to the Grand Canyon for over a dozen years now, and I remember somebody just offhandedly said, yeah, there was a plane crash out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, okay, well, that's cool. Well, then as time went on, someone said it was 1956. I'm like, okay, and it wasn't just a plane crash. It was two planes collided. And I'm sitting here going, how do two planes collide over this?
Yeah, really. It's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's like you got this huge wide open space. You have two aircraft. They had to see each other. But then I didn't put in, I never put it into my mind that that's, how aviation works today is not how it worked back then.
Mm-hmm.
And then somebody said, well, yeah, there's a marker in the cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
So my ears perked up and said, there's a cemetery here?
Yeah. Yeah, who would have even known that?
Yeah. So I tracked that down and, there's that marker. And kind of like you, one thing led to another, and I had met a flight crash expert who sent me the link to the file on it all. And again, I go back to the fact that there's a lot of theories on this, but nobody wrote a book and said, let's just look at everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then I came across your book. Where do you get your writing style?
My writing style? Well, I've been writing for my whole adulthood. Anything interesting that would come to me, if I felt inclined, I would write about. And it just developed from there. And language has been a thing I'm interested in, or was interested in, for my whole life anyway. I mean, even when I was a little kid, back by the time I went to kindergarten, my mom and I had already read all the books in the children's library.
Wow.
So English was a big deal to me anyway. I always liked expressing myself.
Okay. What captured me was that your writing style in the book is, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but like you have a Twilight Zone approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you put us in their place.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about what it was like at the airport, what the people went through, signing in, logging in, the little coincidences, I guess we can call them fate, the fact that, the first officer for the United flight was changed at the last minute. You talk about one of the passengers who caught the flight earlier than he had planned because he wanted to surprise his wife.
I know. A lot of that.
Yeah. When you get into a point where there's different theories or different ways to look at it, you stop us and go, okay, let's look at each of these points individually and why this one might work and this one might not work, which I found to be fascinating because you just put us in, you talk about what it was like to possibly be sitting in a United plane in 1956, first class, what the crew was like, and all that. You can almost put yourself there and then the crash.
Mm-hmm.
But what got me hooked into the book was your foreword, your story about your grandpa.
Mm-hmm.
And, and the paint and the tools.
Mm-hmm.
And that
incredible.
Yeah. From what I've read on it and from what I've seen on it, nobody had ever looked at it from that perspective.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I haven't seen anything similar.
So, you got to have just reams of interviews and materials here on this one.
Mm-hmm.
When you contacted the people that you use as a reference, were they kind of shocked or were they guarded that somebody was still interested in this after 60 years?
A couple were. Actually, I was quite surprised. Most of them were completely open and trusting. And in this day and age, or the times 15 or 20 years ago when I began doing all this, that was a real surprise to me. But there were a few that were guarded. A few asked questions like, was I a reporter?
Right.
Some wanted to know why I was doing it before they would proceed with answering any of my questions. They wanted to be sure, I think, that I wasn't using this for any, selfish purpose or something like that.
Going back to what you wrote in the foreword, that this mattered to you and this was a personal journey for you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, I've seen the Civil Aeronautics Board report, and I agree with you at the very end of the book where, they just said, yeah, shit happens.
Yeah, I shouldn't laugh. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because I'm frustrated, that's why.
Yeah, exactly. And I could not imagine having this happen to my wife and having a federal agency look at me and go, hey, it happened, and then walk away from it.
I know. Isn't that something?
It's
a shame.
And I know, well, it's just that, yes, I know nobody knows what exactly happened, but at least give me something other than, it happened.
It happened, yeah.
Yeah.
They didn't see each other in time. Well, that's, to me, that goes almost without saying. It's not definite. They might have seen each other in time and made mistakes with how they reacted, but almost for sure, like in almost any other accident, the people involved didn't see each other in time to prevent it.
Right.
So it's almost like they weren't telling us anything. The difference was that between what they did and what the average person would do is that they did a tremendous amount of research trying to figure out what the answer was, and that's all it came down to. So at least it was an educated statement of probability, but mostly it was educated in the sense that they failed to prove otherwise. There wasn't any real proof that the crews didn't see each other in time, because they, like I said, they could have, and they could have made wrong maneuvers and hit each other anyway, or even caused the accident when it only would have been a close call had they done nothing.
Right.
We just don't know.
Well, I know when I take my group to the marker at the Grand Canyon Airport, one of the first questions I get, and it's usually from somebody that's under 50 years of age, but it's like, why did it take so long to find them? Not realizing that back then they didn't have a control tower.
Mm-hmm. Not out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah. It was, okay, the plane didn't cross a marker. And then it's like, well, let's give it a couple minutes and see if it shows up. If not, I'll make a phone call.
Mm-hmm.
That's
right.
Now it's a blip, it's a blip on a radar. But what was that like to go through to talk to these people about, the fact that nobody really did anything for several hours because that's the way they did it?
Just about everybody I talked to already knew that, because they were just about all people from that time who had been connected with the airlines one way or another, or had lost a family member. One guy was still emphatic that it was, in his mind, unconscionable that they waited that long. That was his exact word. And I think I agree with him almost, with a little bit of a proviso. It was unconscionable for sure in that if the planes had crash landed, there could have been survivors that didn't have long to live if they weren't rescued,
right,
badly injured. And so any delay could have killed more people. But on the other hand, I can see that the government had to expend its resources somewhat cautiously, or it would have exhausted them and saved less lives in the long run. That's a hard thing to weigh.
Yeah.
I don't remember anybody being, except for that one guy, being really indignant about it, probably because of the fact that there was no one to save.
Right.
Still, you would think people would be indignant about the fact that no one even tried for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
For someone who's mortally wounded, or not mortally wounded, but I mean wounded badly enough that he's going to die if he doesn't get attention fast.
Well, it's interesting that this happened where it happened, first of all, but the way it happened, where it happened, I mean, this was like the most remote part of the Grand Canyon you could ever imagine going into.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that one plane clipped the other, and then the one plane just literally just fell.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one went straight into a butte.
Mm-hmm.
And going back again to your writing style, the fact that you brought in that they
from the time they hit to the time they crashed was, what, minute and a half?
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, going back to your writing style, you talk about how the United plane clipped the TWA plane. The TWA plane went straight down to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
The United plane flew for another minute, and then so the passengers on the United plane saw this happening.
Yeah.
Isn't
that horrible? Yep.
Yeah.
They knew. They might not have known what was happening, but they knew they were descending fast from the sky.
Yeah.
Outside windows, they couldn't see much except the canyon or the clouds, depending on what the circumstance was at any given moment.
Right.
I think they had to go through a cloud layer to get down below it where they could see from then on to the end.
The Air Museum there in Vail, was that Plains of Fame?
In Vail?
Yeah.
I don't think I know that one.
Okay.
Vail, Colorado, you mean?
No.
Valley?
Yeah.
I pronounce it Valley, but maybe it is
right.
Vail. Okay, I know the one you mean.
They used to have a Constellation and a DC-7 parked next to each other. And I talked to one of the guides there, and he said that they did that because of the plane crash, to show people what those two aircrafts were.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to actually go on the Constellation because the Connie that was there was the Constellation that MacArthur used in the Korean War. But anyway, that's a large looking plane, but when you get into it, it's a small plane.
Yeah, true. It is compared to ones nowadays.
Yeah,
the bigger ones nowadays.
This is the one that's got the dual wings, the tails. It looks like it's got two tails on it.
You mean the three tails?
Yeah.
One?
Yep, that's it. Sorry. No.
Yep, the Constellation.
Yeah, and everyone just calls it a Connie. And that was the TWA plane.
Right.
And that one was the one that was running late on takeoff.
They both were actually, but the Constellation by a good deal more. The Constellation was 25 minutes behind. Let me think. How far behind was the DC-7? More like 13 minutes, I believe.
Okay.
Right. The takeoff times that were scheduled were 9:30 and 9:45 Pacific Daylight Time, and they didn't take off until, TWA departed the gate at 9:55, and United departed the gate at 9:58.
Okay.
They departed almost together, even though they were scheduled to depart about 15 minutes apart.
Right.
Which is one of the reasons for which they collided, in my opinion.
Yeah.
One of the reasons for which they were able to. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. Well. It's just that whole little things along the way add up to one big thing.
Yeah, that's right. The little things add up to one big thing.
Now, okay, so the TWA flight number 2 was a Constellation. United Flight 718 was a DC-7, which was the last year of the props. The DC-8 was a jet.
Yeah, that's right.
And so the DC-7 kind of looks like what we would classify as a 737 now, kind of. Yeah,
similar to that.
Yeah.
The fuselage, you mean? Primarily?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing that I found interesting reading your book is how things are handled today. Like they were back then. You talk about how when you use the word airline, whether it was one word or two words. It's like you're arguing over that. We call it airline.
I just wanted my audience to understand that when they see it one word or see it two words, it's not that the poor typographer did a poor job.
Right. well, it's that, and I remember watching there's a show on, I think it's the History Channel, about why planes crash.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember up until the 1980s, the captain was God. Nobody questioned the captain, and you had this pecking order of, captain, co-pilot, and, everyone else. And so the procedures back then were, you followed that,
Mm-hmm.
which
That's right.
which added to, again, those little things that add up to a bigger thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then
It can, and it probably did.
yeah, and then you go over some of the media after the crash on some of the stories that they made up about the crash. It's like, boy, that sounds familiar.
Yeah, doesn't it? They're still doing that.
60 years ago, though, they were taking little things and making them into big mountains and missing all of the real facts. So, What was your surprise in all this? Was there anything that you just went, wow, okay?
I was very surprised, for one, that the media concluded that the DC-7 rear-ended the Constellation. That's just a silly idea, unless they had both been inside of a cloud, which would have been bordering on absurd because it would be so stupid.
Mm-hmm.
These guys knew what they were doing. They knew better than to fly inside of a cloud.
Right.
Especially in uncontrolled airspace where no one would be ensuring their safe separation from even other IFR flights. But that shocked me. What was another one? The notion that the Constellation came up into the DC-7 from underneath because they were climbing. They had changed their altitude clearance and they were climbing. Well, yeah, they were, but about an hour before the accident, they had achieved the 21,000-foot cruising altitude way before the two planes hit each other. So that surprised me. And that this stuff could go for so long without anybody challenging it.
Yeah.
So it just gets repeated over and over down the years, these wrong stories.
Mm-hmm.
So that shocked me and it disturbed me, and I wanted to try to set that right if I could.
Yeah.
At least to undo the false stories.
Right. Well, it was interesting when you got into that section of the aftermath where the Salt Lake City tower had the recording but did not listen to it. And then, but he had to call down to, if I remember right, he checked with the Air Force because this was part of the Air Force zone.
That's right.
And then, so they had to make all these phone calls and literally have a meeting about whether or not to say, oops.
Mm-hmm. That's about right. They had to have a meeting. That's part of their protocol.
Yeah.
That's part of what I was referring to, that some people thought was unconscionable, that they would take so much time and be so careful when people might be dying.
Yeah.
In the meantime, if one of the planes had managed to crash land instead of just crash. Anyway, I lost the thread of my own sentence there. What were we saying?
well, it's just that whole protocol scene. Okay, it even goes back to the aircraft itself. For them to make a maneuver, they would have to call their office, and then their office would have to check with somebody else, and then okay, so that's part of the reason that the United plane didn't know that the TWA. Because there's this long line of phone calls that got to be made.
That's right. You mean for approval for changing a clearance?
Yeah.
And route? Yeah. That's
okay.
True. It was a big ordeal.
And then it's like, okay, the plane did not cross the imaginary line when it was supposed to, so let's give it another 15 minutes to see what happens, shall we? I had this vision in my head of some guy in a trailer with a beer in his hand waiting to see, it's like, yep, that's the 415. Yep, okay, got it.
Isn't that something? They just more or less arbitrarily picked these times. Well, not entirely. I mean, I suppose it was in conjunction with where the next reporting points should have been. At least the timing was coincidental.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, where do they come up with this? They're going to wait so long before they even start looking.
Yeah. Now the title of the book, We Are Going In. Where did that come from?
We Are Going In. Those were the last known four words spoken by the co-pilot on the United plane. His last message, his distress call, was Salt Lake, and then he paused and said, United 718, we are going in. And that was it. And that meant, in pilot's jargon, that they were going to crash. Like, we are going into the drink.
Right. That kind of gave me, shivers. Actually, it still does. That's what came across. And from what you said is that's exactly what he said. We are going in.
Yeah.
And
it gives me shivers, too.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
I mean, I just cannot imagine someone realizing, they're looking at this butte and they know it's going to hit.
Mm-hmm.
And just, hey, Salt Lake, bye.
I know. I can't imagine it either. The composure of the man is just astounding. That he was able to send that message that's according to procedure, and I think also part of his duty in case there would be some survivors. He had to tell somebody what was going to happen. But where he was, I'm sure he didn't hold out any hope of surviving.
No.
Because he could see everything up front.
Right.
Whereas the passengers could only have a side view and not a very good one.
Yeah. Well, and then comes the next question, where was the pilot? Well, again, we go back to the way they used to do that. I remember my first flight back in, I think it was 1970. I remember the pilot coming through the cabin and saying hello.
Mm-hmm.
They don't do that
Isn't
anymore.
that nice?
Yeah.
I know.
They don't do that anymore.
No. That was really nice.
Yeah.
And, a great custom, and I don't think it should have been abandoned. I really don't.
No. I mean, especially for me, I remember I was like 8, 9 years old. That gave me that assurance that everything was okay.
Yeah, right, exactly. Which was a wonderful thing.
Right.
It made a flight a real pleasure and an honor, for the passengers.
Yeah. So okay. So then again, we go back to the fact that this could not have happened in a more remote area at like the worst time in June when it's 100 degrees out there.
Mm-hmm.
These guys, then that accidental somebody flew over, saw a cloud, and went, okay, I think that was the crash. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
They had to send these guys out there in the middle of freaking nowhere, middle of summer, to search for this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you go through in really great detail, especially what the United plane had to do, or the searchers for the United plane, because there wasn't much left of that one.
Yeah, well, there wasn't much left of either one.
Right.
But the United site was far more difficult to get to and to explore and search than the TWA site. The TWA site was on sloped but very gently sloped ground. It might as well have been flat. The United site was on just about the opposite, practically a vertical surface, and strewn all down the side of this butte, which ran at probably an 80-degree angle to the horizontal.
Mm-hmm.
They had a terrible time getting to the bodies and the telltale pieces of wreckage.
Again, I applaud you on your writing, because you put us right there. I mean, well, yeah, you talk about how they were getting the searchers onto that butte, and the fact that they were there. There was no going home until this was done.
That's right.
Yeah.
They were stuck. They
Yeah.
had no way out of there.
Meanwhile, they're looking down, and their counterparts are playing in the water.
Mm-hmm.
Well, not playing, but still, it's like, okay, we're up here on this butte, smelling burnt wreckage, sweating, and we're and our guy, and the other guys are down there bathing in cold, clear mountain water.
Oh man, that must have been terrible.
Oh,
can you imagine?
Oh God. The interesting thing is the Navajo still talk about it, which I found interesting because, it took 50, 60 years for the new markers at the Grand Canyon to actually say this is where it happened. But yet you go over to the Navajo and they will literally go, you see that butte over there? A plane hit that in 1956.
Oh, I know. They know all about it, and it's become part of their oral history.
Yeah.
It was a terrible thing, and also an incursion by white man on their sacred
land. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so they went in. They got as much as they could. Now at the Grand Canyon Cemetery, there's a marker that has 33 names on it?
31.
Okay. Where are the rest of the names?
They're absent because the rest of the names were those of identified victims. What that marker's for is to honor and memorialize the unidentified victims, of which there were 29, and then 2 other victims who were traveling with unidentified victims who were themselves identified. 2 of those names are of identified people who aren't buried there.
Okay.
Actually.
Wow. Now, again, going back to, this was interesting because there are 4 coffins buried under there, and the families agreed to have that happen. Now, in Flagstaff is where TWA has their grave, and they did the exact opposite.
Yeah, I know. They laid out 70 caskets.
What did you think when you went to the cemetery in Flagstaff and saw that?
Oh, I was just taken aback. It's so powerful. It made me speechless.
Yeah.
That's so huge.
Yeah.
And there's so many people suffered there around the edges of that plot that's now fenced off with chains and stanchions and all that. But I don't know. True reverence is what I felt when I was there. And I just sat there silently for a long time and took it in.
It was interesting because I went looking for that. My wife and I were up in that area, and I had a map off of Google trying to find it. And all of a sudden, my wife was driving. She kind of had the same thing. She just stopped. She listened. She goes, "That's got to be it." And I'm like, "What?" And she goes, "I just have this feeling that is it." And then I looked over and I saw, that big plot, and I just went, and that's where it was. But again, it was that whole, you just stand at that edge there, and you're just like, wow.
I know. It's overwhelming.
But
you don't say too much or think too much. You just feel it.
Yeah. And it's almost the same thing at the Grand Canyon. It's almost the same but different, because you just look at that and go, why and how? And
why and how?
Yeah.
They had primarily clear skies. There were some clouds, but the sky was probably 95% free of them. How in the heck did they run into each other? It's just beyond belief. It still is, to me, beyond belief, even after all the work I've done on it. And or maybe partly because of all the work I've done on it, too.
I was talking to my wife about this last night because I'm from Minnesota. I'm from southeastern Minnesota, down by the Iowa border. And that whole area down there is very religious in its management, I guess. Okay. everyone goes to church on Sunday. In the beginning of the book, you brought up a point that I always wondered the exact same thing. Did these people know?
Yeah.
You're walking out across the tarmac. Basically, both flights are walking out together, and they're looking at each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, that's very powerful.
Yeah.
Somebody must have sensed something.
Yeah.
You know.
Was this fate? No.
Yes, I think so. I think it must have been, but I think they knew, and a couple of them had to have known something was really the matter. Human beings are too intuitive for 128 people all together at the same time to not know anything of what was to come. Any group of 128, you'd have somebody knowing something, sensing something.
Yeah. And then just the fact that it happened in the middle of nowhere, and the only piece that ties it together is one cloud out of an otherwise blue sky.
Yeah, isn't that something? That was the obstacle around which they both had to fly, at least as I envisioned the whole thing. Yeah, and why did they hit each other as they came around that?
Yeah.
Every pilot knew that was the most dangerous area in the whole sky, coming around a cloud, and that another airplane could appear from the other side right there before you could do anything about it. And yet they must have been close enough in for them to be unable to avoid each other, you would think.
Right.
Plus, I also posited this, that there could have been mishaps in the cockpits. There were so many other coincidences. Why not that one, too?
Oh, yeah.
That some sort of minor mishap distracted them at that critical moment. And even though they were far enough from the cloud to have afforded themselves the time to see each other and take evasive action, they didn't see each other in time. Well,
again, I go back to the way you wrote this is you basically said, okay, let's stop this moment in time, and here are the three basic theories of what happened at this moment. And you literally kind of walked us through each one of those theories. Now, I'm not a detailed guy. I don't like to get into great detail. Just tell me this, just tell it to me. But the way you looked at each of those probabilities, you just took it, turned it upside down, twisted it around, and I went, okay, that's why this one probably doesn't work more than this one. And so, I just envision you with a 3D model basically going, okay, let's turn the cloud here, let's put the plane here. Now, what happened? So, so after all of this research that you've done, are you a pretty good guy at flying?
No, I don't fly. I have flown as a passenger, but I don't have a pilot's license. I would have had, as a part of doing this whole project, I decided that it would help if I were an actual pilot. And I looked into lessons, and at the time they were just slightly more than I could afford, and that's the way that went. I never got back to that. Well, they're very expensive.
Oh yeah, it is. But at the same time, you did some research on this. Your whole back pages on the definitions and your resources is like, this guy could probably fly his own jet by now.
Well, thanks for the vote of confidence. I might be able to fly a plane if I got in one, but I wouldn't put myself in that spot if I could help it. Because I've never had a single lesson. So.
How easy was it to get the resources that you used in this book?
Very difficult. A lot of it came really fast and was very easy, but the bulk of the material was very difficult to ever find. I had to search all over the place, and some of it I've still not ever found. I did eventually find almost everything I was trying to, but sometimes it would take half a year or 2 or 3 years and multiple efforts. I'll give you an example. The Civil Air Regulations manual took forever to find. I didn't find that until after the first edition was in print. And before the second edition was, I had references to it that I was able to make printed matter from other transcripts. So I was able to quote the manual based on those quotes, but that one was a heck of a chore. And I finally found that on the internet being sold by a guy who just humbly said he thought it might be important. And he was selling it for a good deal, and I bought it.
Wow.
Yeah.
well, I
he
know.
Found it amongst his father's effects. So.
And just thought he'd hang on to it.
And then that he would pass it on if anyone was interested.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So what's next for you?
What's next?
Yeah.
I think, believe it or not, I think probably fiction. I want to write another history, but I think I want to write a fiction first. And I've been working on one, and it's kind of fun,
Yeah.
But I'll tell you something. You know what I've discovered about fiction? It takes just as much research and just as much note-keeping as fact. You have to keep this whole complex story straight, and all these details and dates and times and people, and tell the most elaborate lie, so to speak.
Right.
And it's just as complex as the truth.
I never thought of that, but to keep, because you're going to find someone that goes, hey, he didn't say that back 200 pages ago. That's, because there's that one guy that, back in page 6, you didn't say that.
That's right.
This doesn't match.
Cool. That's right. You got to be really careful writing fiction. It's a lot of fun. It's not as easy as I thought it would be for that reason, but it's a lot of fun. Anyway.
What has been the general reaction of the general public to this book?
Good.
Yeah?
Most people are very impressed and pleased and grateful. A lot of people have written to me thanking me for taking the trouble to do all this, because it made things so much clearer, even though it doesn't answer the ultimate question, what happened.
Right.
It explores what might have happened, and
it gives them a sense. Yeah.
Right.
It's, again, going back to the official report that just basically said it happened.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not good enough.
Not nearly good enough. No. Well, I wouldn't be comforted by that a bit if I lost my own spouse, for example.
So now you have your uncle's tools, right?
My grandfather's.
Okay, all right.
Not my uncle.
What does it feel like now to look at them? Now that you've done all of that research, is there a different...
History.
Pardon? So knowing what you know now of the entire story, when you look at those tools, is there a different feeling about them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel much more tangibly, concretely connected to my grandfather and to what he was going through at the time, because I've nurtured my own sense of the thing so much. I'm able to empathize with him a lot better than I was. And I think I always empathized with him fairly well, but not like I do now. Those tools are mementos of that disaster, as surely as a piece of wreckage.
Yeah. Okay. Now, on my tours, I've worked very intimately with the Navajo people.
Mm-hmm.
And they believe that we don't die. We just move to the next part of life.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever feel that from your grandfather after this book was done?
I felt it from my uncle.
Okay.
Who was the victim. Not Grandpa so much, because I had always felt close to him. I haven't felt like he has come to talk to me, if that's what you mean.
Yes.
Not Grandpa. My uncle, though, there have been times where I felt like he was somewhere very near at hand. And for the most part, though, my impression is that he's gone and he has moved on. I think everybody in that is still in existence. I believe that too, just like the Navajo. I think most of them have moved on. I can't justify that rationally. It's just an impression.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time. I am not a one to really buy books. I'm starting to get with this whole ebook thing. All right. But to actually sit down and read, a real book is cool. You put a lot of time and a lot of passion in this book.
Oh, thank you.
And I appreciate that because I think a lot of people will benefit from that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not a techie book. It's not a book that gets heavy into the you talk about what's happening and what's there, but it's not down to the last bolt was turned by this. Okay. I think a lot of people will enjoy the book over the fact that you do look at it from the different possibilities and you let the reader make up their mind.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I hope so. I hope that it stimulates people to think. I'm sure it will. If they could stick with it as far as it takes to get to the end, they will have had to do some thinking along the way. And,
in the foreword, you advise them, okay, if you're not really wanting to get into the details, here's what you can skim over, which is what I kind of liked. I went, man, okay, he's thinking about this one.
Yeah. I wasn't sure how much people would want to know, but fortunately it wasn't so complicated to say what you could skip. And they still get a pretty good picture with it, even if they do skip all that.
What's your website?
So my website is called just wearegoingin.com. It's the title of the book. And you can get more from that. You can also get the book through that from me, signed and everything. Your copy's probably not signed. But
no, actually, you did sign it. Thank you very much.
We are back. Thank you, Mike, for the time and the information. The book is We Are Going In, the story of the 1956 Grand Canyon midair collision. As always, the links will be in the show notes. Like this podcast, leave me your comments and questions, and for more information, you can go to thevegastours.com. I'm Mark Anthony. Have yourself a great week.
It's getting dark.